The Marines in World War II actually started at the bombing of the naval facility at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The USS Arizona, of course, is the most famous battle casualty of that engagement, where almost over 1,100 sailors and Marines were killed just in that one bomb that exploded that set off the tremendous fire and explosion on the Arizona. The Arizona is still at Pearl Harbor today. You can visit it 365 days a year. But the Marines in World War II actually started, again, instead of Pearl Harbor, but the first major battle in the Second World War involving the Marines was at Wake Island. And it was a small island in the Pacific where the Japanese wanted to take it only because the Marines were there. And there was a small detachment of Marines there under, I think it was a Major Devereux was his name. And the Japanese took it for granted, and their first landing party was repulsed by not only Marines, but there were many civilian construction workers there who picked up the arms and actually fought the Japanese. And the Japanese retreated from their original battle and went back to their ships. The batteries off the island sunk one Japanese destroyer, which was the first major warship that was sunk by the United States. After a few days, of course, the battle turned. They were overwhelmed and Wake Island fell. But it was the battle cry, really, of the Second World War was remember the Wake, like remember the Alamo and remember Pearl Harbor. After Wake Island, the Marines turned into an amphibious force. And we were involved mostly in the Pacific. There were a few Marines in Europe, but most of them were aboard battleships or warships. But in the Pacific is where the Marines earned their battle stripes. And the first major battle that the Marines were involved in was in 1943, which was a small atoll in the Pacific called Tarawa. Tarawa was a bloody battle, and in the first day, more Marines were killed in that one day than had been killed in World War I or all the history of the Marine Corps up to that time. But after 3 days, the Marines did secure Tarawa, but it was a terrible loss of life. If I remember right, I'm going to test my memory, I think like 1,500 Marines were killed just in the 3 days of the Battle of Tarawa. The Marines learned a lot from the Battle of Tarawa because they had a lot of bad intelligence, they had a lot of bad weather reports, tides and coral reefs and stuff. The next major battle was between the Japanese and the United States at Guadalcanal. And in Guadalcanal, the 1st Marine Division landed, and in the meantime, the Navy, which wasn't as strong as it is today, was defeated in a couple of major skirmishes, and they actually withdrew, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal without any reinforcements, no supplies. They had to fend for themselves under General Vandergrift, who was the 1st Marine Division commander then. But at Guadalcanal, we also earned and learned of our greatest hero in the Marine Corps in the Second World War, which was John Basilone. He was a machine gunner who earned the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal with a machine gun detachment. General Vandergrift later became the commandant of the Marine Corps. But it was almost, I believe, a 6-month battle back and forth between the Japanese and the Americans before the Japanese were finally thrown off of Guadalcanal. The Marines regrouped in places like New Zealand, New Guinea, Australia, and then their next major battle of the Pacific War was probably Saipan and Tinian. There were some battles in between there, but Saipan and Tinian were great battles. My uncle fought with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, all the way from Guadalcanal up to Tinian and Saipan. First battle in Saipan, the Marines suffered tremendously there, but they did secure the island. And my uncle was involved in that, and then they went over to Tinian, which was like 4 miles away. It's another island. And at Tinian, my uncle was shot 3 times in the back, survived the war, survived up until I went into the Marines in 1963. But the Japanese were thrown off of Tinian. And one of the great things about Tinian was from Tinian, the air base at Tinian is where the Enola Gay was equipped with the atom bomb and dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima off the airfield that we gained at Tinian. But the island hopping was the philosophy of not only MacArthur, but of Admiral Nimitz, who both controlled the Pacific. One was the Central Pacific, the other was the South Pacific. The next battle that we all will remember the most, probably the most famous battle in the Marine Corps history, was Iwo Jima. And it was a small island, 3 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. And it was defended by about 22,000 Japanese. Their commander had gone to Harvard, graduated, was westernized. He knew a lot about the United States, and he dug in. He dug tunnels, and the bombardments beforehand had absolutely no effect. So when the Marines landed, it was a sulfur base. It was hard to dig in. It was hard for them to manipulate, but they finally took Iwo Jima. They started on the 19th of February of 1945. On the 23rd, the Marines raised the first battle flag over Japanese territory on Iwo Jima on top of Mount Suribachi. The flag was too small. The ships out in the bay could not see it, and actually the Secretary of Navy, Forrestal, was there, and he wanted a bigger flag. So he ordered a bigger flag, and somebody went to an LST, which was a Navy ship, got a bigger flag, which is the famous flag. It's famous to the public. The first flag is famous to the Marines because that was the one that was up there first. But the first one was taken down, folded up. The second one was starting to be raised when Joseph Lowenthal was a reporter, I think for the Associated Press, just happened to see it and took his little box camera and just clicked it without knowing if he even took the picture or not. It became the most iconic photograph of World War II, of the Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima. Of the men who raised the flag on Iwo Jima, 3 of them were killed there. The only one that was positively, over the years, different men were said to have been there. Corman was supposed to be one of them. But it turned out that later, through investigations from the military and mostly from civilian amateur historians, it was determined that the only one that actually was involved in both flag raising was Ira Hayes. And Ira Hayes was a Navajo Native American who survived the war, but died soon after in the Indian reservation in Arizona. But we honor Ira Hayes. There was a song actually called Ira Hayes that Johnny Cash made. But Iwo Jima was probably the last major battle that the Marines fought by themselves, although there were some Army troops that did land at Iwo Jima, but it was later. Then, of course, the last major battle of the Second World War in either the Pacific or Europe was in Okinawa, and that started on Easter Sunday of 1945. And it lasted about to the end of the war, really, which was in September. But we lost, for the first time in the history of our country, we lost a Lieutenant General Buckner, General Buckner, who was in charge of all the forces on Okinawa, the Army, Navy, the Air Forces, and the Marines. And when he was killed, then General Geiger, who was a Marine, took command, and it was the only time in the history of the United States where a Marine general was in charge of an Army Corps. And of course, after Okinawa, the Japanese were completely defeated. That was their home territory. And then, like I said, the 2 bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in August of '45 ended the war. And the Marines came home with a legacy that is second to none in the history of fighting forces. You can take the Spartans, you can take the French Foreign Legion, the Army Green Berets. The Marine Corps as a Marine means more and has more impact than almost any unit. The Army is called soldiers. The Navy are called sailors, and the Air Force is called airmen. But Marines have their title written on their arms and chests and legs and everywhere. Capital M-A-R-I-N-E-S. Marines. So Semper Fi, a short history of the United States Marines and World War II.
All right.